I never thought a text message could take the breath out of me, but when I read Marcus's words, "You won't be joining us on the cruise. Simone wants it to be just family," my lungs locked like I'd swallowed glass. It was 9:04 a.m. on a Tuesday in early October, the Georgia sun glaring through my kitchen window like it was in on the joke. I stood there with my thumb hovering over the screen, rereading that sentence, the word just, needling me like a burr, just family, as if I wasn't. Their house in Roswell, a wide-porched colonial with black shutters and a custom mailbox I paid extra to install, still had my name printed first on the deed. That house cost $940,000. I remember the exact number because I signed the paperwork myself at that stone-faced lawyer's office on Marietta Street. And still, after all that, I was not family enough to board the cruise ship they'd chartered with my money. I felt like a kicked dog left outside in the rain, after raising the house it slept in. The kettle whistled behind me, and I didn't even move to turn it off. My hand was frozen, phone still lit, thumb trembling. I'd been looking forward to that cruise. I'd even ordered new sandals and a sun hat, stupidly imagining a deck chair beside Simone, sipping overpriced cocktails, and pretending we were close. Instead, I stood alone in my kitchen, the laminate floor curling at the edges from age, the smell of burnt toast still lingering from breakfast. I pressed the screen off and sat down slowly, knees cracking. I thought of how I'd helped them qualify for the house, how I'd used the same investment account Harold and I had built over decades, brick by brick, year by year, to give Marcus what I never had growing up in Savannah, a financial leg up. I'd signed my name and transferred my peace of mind into their foundation, thinking it would mean I was building roots into their lives. But no, it was like I'd been erased, quietly, efficiently, replaced by cruise tickets and Instagram captions. The betrayal didn't scream, it whispered. It wasn't a slap, it was a door gently closing in my face. And then it hit me. The hollowness wasn't just sadness, it was clarity. They were showing me exactly who they were. And from that moment on, I was going to show them who I was too. 2 months before that text, on a blistering August morning, I sat at my dining table with a ballpoint pen in my hand and the login screen of Morgan Stanley open on my laptop. The AC struggled against the southern heat, and I remember the way a bead of sweat rolled down my spine as I reviewed the wire details one last time. $210,000, an exact, enormous number. I read it aloud like it might shrink if I heard it in my own voice. Routing number, account number, memo line. For down payment, 239 Dovecote Lane. That street name alone had sounded like a promise, like a final chapter where I might finally be part of their beginning. The investment account I pulled from wasn't some trust fund. It was made of blood work and frugality, 31 years of saving what Harold and I never spent. A little here, a little there. I sold the last of the Chevron shares he left me, clipped off some annuities, and withdrew early from a modest CD that still had 2 years left to mature. I took the penalty. No hesitation. My son was buying his first home with his wife, and I told myself I wouldn't let pride or paperwork get in the way. Marcus had called the night before, excitement crackling in his voice like old vinyl. "Mama, we found it! Real hardwoods! Corner lot! Fenced backyard. Simone can finally get her garden. But we're short for the offer. They're asking for proof of funds by Monday." I had paused just long enough for him to notice. Then I said yes. Of course I said yes. That's what mothers do when their sons sound like boys again. The next morning, August 3rd, I clicked submit on the wire transfer, heart thudding like it had when I sent Marcus off to Morehouse. I even smiled foolishly. I imagined myself walking through their new front door with a peach cobbler, maybe holding a spare key on a ribbon. Part of something permanent, finally. Not just the helper. Not just the checkbook. I didn't know then that permanence, for them, meant only the parts they could claim as theirs. That my name on the transfer would fade long before the new paint dried. The text may have landed like a slap, but the truth had been unraveling for months, soft and sly like a thread pulled from the hem of a good Sunday dress. I saw it first in Simone's tone. Not cruel, just sharp. Each word clipped short, like I was a receptionist she didn't quite have time for. She'd call me Miss L in public, which always sounded polite enough, but it was the kind of Southern formality meant to place distance, not respect. And Marcus, my Marcus, had started dodging church services the way a child feigns stomach aches to skip school. "Too tired, Mama. Big week ahead," he'd say, rubbing the back of his neck and glancing at Simone like he needed clearance to speak freely. I kept brushing it off, assigning it to newlywed busyness. Young couples get swept up. I told myself that over and over, especially when their housewarming invitation never came. They posted pictures of it online. Simone grinning in a burnt orange jumpsuit, holding up a flute of champagne, the dining table dressed in white candles and eucalyptus leaves. Her friends from Howard stood shoulder to shoulder, all high heels and contour. Not a single soul from our church. Not a single fold-out chair for me. Still, I sent them a congratulatory basket through edible arrangements. Told myself maybe the invite got lost. Maybe they were saving a private tour for me. That's what I told Deacon Charles when he asked if I'd seen the inside yet. I smiled too quickly and said, "Soon, I'm sure." The cracks kept coming. Phone calls returned late. My birthday marked by a group text and an Amazon gift card. One Sunday, I left peach preserves in a mason jar on their doorstep. The jar came back to me weeks later in a paper bag, the label peeled, the lid sticky. No note. And still, I waited. Still believed. Because belief in your children is the last thing a mother's willing to surrender, even when her eyes can't keep denying what her heart already knows. So when I read Just Family that morning in October, it wasn't just a betrayal. It was confirmation. They hadn't forgotten me. They had chosen to erase me. By August 10th, the Georgia heat had thickened to the kind that curled edges of paper and made car interiors feel like ovens. I wore linen and carried a folder under my arm, the kind of quiet armor a woman my age learns to wear when the heart starts shifting from hope to resolve. First Atlanta Bank sat just off Peachtree Street, its glass facade reflecting a city that didn't pause for heartbreak. Inside, the marble floors cooled the soles of my shoes, and the receptionist smiled at me like I was still just another sweet mother making a deposit for her child's future. But I wasn't. The folder I handed to the banker held everything. My original cosigner authorization for Marcus and Simone's mortgage, the wire confirmation for the $210,000, and my own breakdown of the remaining $38,000 I'd earmarked for upgrades. Simone had a list. Custom backsplash, California closets, smart lighting, all things she swore they couldn't afford without my help. She'd said it like we were planning together, like I was part of the blueprint. That morning, I told the banker, Mr. Choi, a small man with kind eyes and precise diction, that I needed to revoke my secondary signer status on their mortgage, effective immediately. I watched his fingers pause on the keyboard, his eyes flick up to meet mine. "Mrs. Ellison, is everything all right?" "Everything is clear," I replied, steady. "That's why I'm here." We moved swiftly after that. I had called ahead, and the paperwork was ready. I initialed each line without flinching, signed my full name at the bottom, and slid the folder back into my bag. Then I asked to freeze the $38,000 remaining in the linked upgrade account. Not cancel it, just hold it. Mr. Choi hesitated, then nodded. "Would you like to place a formal restriction on disbursement?" "Yes," I said. "No funds released without my written approval. In person." It was the first time in months I felt the ground solid under me. Back outside, the sun hadn't cooled, but something inside me had. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, cars rushing past, and realized this was what reclaiming space felt like. Not a shout, not a scene, but a series of quiet, notarized decisions. That same week, with the city still sweltering and my patience worn thin like a threadbare quilt, I took a MARTA train downtown and climbed the narrow stairs to Caldwell and Finch, a law office tucked between a tax preparer and a faded bakery that still smelled of yeast and sugar. Jeanette Caldwell had been my attorney since before Marcus was tall enough to reach the mailbox. She'd helped Harold and me write our first wills, settle my mother's estate, and retitled the Chevy we drove into the ground. She wasn't warm, exactly, but she was precise in a way that made you sit up straighter just by being near her. I laid the notarized gift letter on her desk, unfolded like a confession. It was dated March 6th, signed in blue ink by all three of us, me, Marcus, Simone. The language was something I barely remembered drafting, scrawled out during those optimistic weeks when I believed in new beginnings, and Simone still pretended to call me Mama. Jeanette adjusted her glasses and read in silence, her pencil tapping against her desk like a second hand on a slow clock. Finally, she looked up. "You did not structure this as a gift," she said, her voice clipped but calm. "You worded it as a conditional grant, contingent upon your inclusion in major property-related decisions, and specifically your name remaining on the title until further notice." "I thought so," I said, though truthfully, I hadn't thought much at all. I'd scribbled out that language from a sample document I'd found online, more interested in looking helpful than being protected. But Jeanette gave me a look I hadn't seen in years, a flicker of professional admiration. "You did more than protect yourself," she said. "You've created a paper trail they can't erase." I swallowed hard, that mixture of shame and relief rising like old tea left too long on the stove. She handed me a copy of the letter, annotated now with yellow tabs. "Keep this safe. We may need it." I slid it into the folder beside the bank papers, the deed copy, the frozen funds notice. That folder, once thin with trust, was starting to gain weight. It was becoming a shield. Simone had waved it off like it was a typo. I remember her exact words, spoken casually over the phone back in March. "It's just a clerical thing, Miss L. They'll update it after closing." She was talking about the deed. I'd noticed the line while scanning the closing documents before wiring the down payment. A quiet entry listing me as primary on the title. My name first. No "and" or joint tenancy language. Just mine, then theirs. It was supposed to be a formality, a placeholder, until the county clerk updated the records. Or so Simone said, laughing lightly, the way people do when they want you to feel silly for asking questions. I wanted to believe her. I'd told myself then that it didn't matter whose name came first if we were all building something together. So I let it go. But after the bank visit, after sitting across from Jeanette and hearing the word enforceable, I pulled up the deed again, this time with a different set of eyes. The county's public e-records site was clunky, but revealing. There it was, filed on March 14th, document ID-2023 to 11,788, recorded under my full legal name. No amendments. No transfers. No corrections filed in the 7 months since closing. I printed it out that night, the toner catching slightly on the edges, leaving faint gray smudges near the bottom. Still, the line was there in bold. Owner of record, Ellison, Loretta May. No asterisks, no revisions. The so-called mistake had become the truth they chose to ignore, because it served them better that way. It was a strange feeling, realizing that negligence had become my leverage. They hadn't removed me from the deed because they assumed I wouldn't check. Or maybe they thought I wouldn't act. Either way, they'd left the gate unlocked, and now I was standing on the other side, with the key still in my pocket. That night, I laid the printed deed beside the gift letter and froze account notice. 3 pieces of paper. Black ink, white lies. It struck me then how quiet real power could be, how it didn't roar or beg. It simply sat there, waiting for you to stop doubting yourself long enough to pick it up. On the morning of August 12th, I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of oversteeped tea and a printout of the deed flattened under my palm. A slow resolve had taken root, fed by every sidestep, every polite dismissal, every glass of sweet tea I'd brought into a house where I now realized I was only ever a sponsor, not a guest. The silence in the room felt different, less like absence, more like preparation. With a few keystrokes and a small filing fee, I logged into the Fulton County Clerk's online portal and submitted a notice of intent to sell. There was a drop-down menu for reason. I hovered briefly over owner relocation, financial need, and then landed on the one that felt truest, other, see comments. In the box I typed, breach of verbal family agreement and lack of inclusive residency, as previously discussed. It was clinical, polite, but loaded with all the quiet fury I didn't say out loud. After filing, I downloaded a fresh copy of the deed and highlighted my ownership line with a neon pink marker. It felt petty. It also felt like armor. This wasn't just a warning shot. It was a flag on the play. Formal, time-stamped, and public. In Georgia, when a co-owner of record files a notice of intent to sell, it sets off a process. The other parties are notified. The records become visible in title searches. And more importantly, it signals that the property is no longer unified under agreement. I had learned this from Jeanette, who called later that afternoon with a subtle grin in her voice. "You're not just holding the cards now, Loretta," she said. "You've put them on the table." I hung up and stared at the blinking cursor on my screen. 100 thoughts rushed in. Marcus calling me dramatic, Simone playing offended, their friends tutting from the sidelines. But I didn't flinch. I imagined them opening that email notification, seeing my name not just on the deed, but now on a legal action they hadn't authorized. A small part of me wanted to be in the room when they read it. Most of me didn't. I had better things to do than monitor their awakening. I wasn't coming for revenge. I was coming to reclaim what they thought I'd forget how to hold. By late August, Simone's Instagram became a theater of performance. Carefully curated glimpses of poolside mocktails, brunch tables set with gold flatware, and the recurring hashtag family only. At first, I scrolled past it with numb fingers, telling myself it was just social media nonsense. But each post felt like a breadcrumb trail, leading to the truth they no longer bothered to hide. She stood beside Marcus in matching linen sets, captioning their countdown to the cruise with phrases like, "Can't wait to unwind with our tribe," as if I hadn't financed the very soil they were planting their joy in. The phone call came on a Thursday afternoon. The one where Marcus, always brave behind a screen, finally called, this time on speaker. I could hear Simone's presence in the background, the slight scoff, the clink of her ring against a glass, the false calm in Marcus's voice. "Hey, Mama," he began, softening his tone like it might undo everything already in motion. "I heard about the notice," he chuckled, as if trying to deflate the moment. "Come on now, it's not that serious." I said nothing, just let the silence breathe between us. Simone's voice entered like a blade disguised in silk. "Loretta, the house is symbolic. We all knew that. The name on paper was just a formality. You said yourself you wanted us to have roots. Roots, yes. But I hadn't meant for them to bury me under them." Marcus tried again, his words stumbling into Simone's orbit. "Look, her parents are coming on the cruise. It's just, her side of the family has certain expectations. You know how that is." "Yes," I said, steady now. "I know exactly how that is." I could hear the discomfort crawling up Marcus's throat, but he didn't stop her when she added, "You've had your time, Miss L. This phase is about us now." That was the moment it crystallized, not just their carelessness, but their certainty. They believed I was past my usefulness, that I'd done my part, and should now smile from the sidelines while they built their filtered version of family. I didn't hang up. I let the silence settle long enough for them to feel the weight of it. Then I said, "You'll want to check the county clerk's site again. I've made another update." By the first week of September, the masks they wore in public began to blur at the edges, but they were still smiling in pixels. Simone had posted a boomerang of her perfectly manicured hand waving 2 cruise tickets above a closed suitcase, captioned with, "Booked and blessed dizzy, #family only, #Astern Caribbean." It was performative joy, sun-drenched and carefully staged, meant to keep their curated world intact. But beneath those hashtags, the cracks were already showing, and I had the documents to prove it. A friend from Bible study, bless her nosy heart, forwarded me their Expedia itinerary, thinking I might want to surprise them at the port. She didn't know I had other plans for that document. The departure date was clearly printed. October 2nd, a 12-day cruise departing from Miami, sailing through St. Kitts, Tortola, and San Juan. What stood out to me most wasn't the destinations. It was the luxury stateroom price, circled in digital ink, $6,420, paid in full. Just days earlier, I had found an envelope buried under a stack of mail addressed to me at the church P.O. box. It was from Greenbridge Financial, Simone and Marcus's financial planner. It had been mistakenly sent to me due to the old co-owner status still associated with the home. The letter inside thanked me for ensuring a stable base for Marcus and Simone's long-term success, dated March 9th. It referenced my generous enabling of favorable loan terms and the strategic advantage of family-backed collateral. I read it 3 times before placing it gently into my growing folder of receipts. They thought of me as a foundation, something structural but invisible. What they hadn't realized was that the foundation gets to decide when to crack, when to shake things loose. That week, I added the itinerary and financial planner letter to the file. Not out of spite, but documentation. Paper doesn't flinch. Paper doesn't gaslight. Paper remembers what people try to rewrite. At the top of the folder, I placed a sticky note with a simple reminder in my own handwriting. Dates, amounts, motives. That became my sermon, my anchor. They were off packing for tropical breezes, unaware I was preparing a different kind of voyage, one that didn't need palm trees, just proof. It was early September when the last illusion finally fell apart. I had spent that afternoon sorting through a plastic file bin in the hallway closet, the kind filled with expired warranties and water-stained instruction manuals. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just trying to clear space, when I came across an unopened statement from Wells Fargo, marked Urgent Delinquency Notice. The address listed wasn't mine, it was theirs, but the account name was unmistakably mine, listed first, tied to a home equity line of credit I hadn't touched in over a year. I sat down on the hallway bench, heart thudding in a slow, measured beat. Page 3 of the statement revealed a disbursement, $28,000, dated July 18th, itemized for kitchen remodel materials and labor. There it was. The renovation Simone had once mentioned in passing, something about needing better counters to host her networking brunches. I dismissed it at the time, figuring she meant someday. But here was the proof, printed in gray ink and red numbers, of a project financed under my name, without permission, and now overdue. The fraud was not just financial, it was moral. They had walked into that bank with my name and walked out with a contractor's check, then left the debt unpaid. And worse still, they hadn't said a word. No request, no apology, not even a mention in passing, just silence wrapped in entitlement. That evening, I called Wells Fargo's fraud department. I gave my name, spelled it slowly, answered every security question, then told the agent plainly, I didn't authorize this draw. I want a formal investigation opened. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, already moving through protocol. Yes, ma'am. We'll place a hold on further disbursements and open a fraud claim immediately. You'll receive a letter within 5 business days. I hung up and exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Not rage, just release. There was no more room for doubt. They hadn't made a mistake, they had made a decision. Later that night, I opened the folder again and slid the statement behind the itinerary and the gift letter. I was no longer just collecting paper. I was building a case. And for the first time, I stopped calling it betrayal. It was theft. The morning after I filed the fraud claim, I drove to a quiet diner off Holcomb Bridge Road, ordered black coffee and eggs I barely touched, and stared out the window as joggers passed in pairs, unaware that someone at the next table was reassembling her dignity. The fraud statement had tipped the balance. I wasn't waiting for them to come home and explain anymore. I was moving. I took the long way back to Roswell, past their neighborhood, down the winding cul-de-sac that ended at the white colonial I had helped them call home. The yard was immaculate. Simone always did have a taste for appearances. But I saw now what I hadn't let myself see before. None of it had anything to do with me. I had built the foundation, but they had drawn the boundaries. I was not part of that picture. I was the watermark they had tried to erase. By mid-afternoon, I was sitting in the corner office of Mason Green, a realtor referred to me by Jeanette. He was efficient and quiet, with kind eyes that didn't widen when I told him the full story. I handed him the folder, now heavy with tabs and truth, and said, I want the house listed before they come back from the cruise. No fanfare, no long discussion. Just a clean, discreet listing with a private showing window. He nodded and said, "We can move fast. Off-market first. Pre-qualified buyers only." We drafted the listing that day. 4-bedroom colonial in Roswell, Georgia. Shared deed holder initiating sale. Proof of ownership attached. When I signed the agreement, my hand didn't shake. There was no sadness, only clarity. It wasn't revenge. It was reallocation. I was simply reclaiming what had been repurposed without permission. Before I left, Mason asked if I had a preference for buyer type. "Just someone who'll respect the place," I said, "and doesn't think of family as something you can edit like a photo caption." That night, I returned to my own home, a place I had once called modest. But for the first time in years, it felt like mine in more than just name. The silence wasn't cold anymore. It was peace, and it was earned. That night, I went back to their house, our house, technically, for one last visit before the showings began. The spare key was still on my ring, untouched since the day we closed. I entered through the side door, into a kitchen that bore the ghost of my generosity. Marble counters gleamed under cold pendant lights I'd never seen lit during a family dinner. A sleek wine fridge hummed where a breakfast nook might have once held coffee mugs and Sunday conversation. Everything was curated, sterile, beautiful in the way magazines are beautiful, but not alive. I walked through the dining room, pausing at the long table Simone had chosen from a boutique in Buckhead. I'd paid for half of it under the line item, move-in necessities, though I hadn't been invited to its first meal. The chairs were still wrapped in quiet, a silence so complete it bordered on indictment. I traced a finger along the edge of the sideboard, remembering how I'd once imagined setting out holiday dishes here, maybe a pie cooling by the window. None of it had happened. I sat down in the middle chair, the one that faced the large bay window, and stayed there long enough for the light to change. I didn't cry. I didn't fume. I just listened to the hollow quiet of a home that had never made space for me. This was the cost of confusing provision with belonging. Around 9 p.m., I called Jeanette. Her voice came through clear and low, no pretense. "You ready to go through with it?" she asked. "More than ready," I said. "It's already listed." There was a pause. Then, that rare thing, her approval. "We'll finalize transfer paperwork next week. You want me at the sale closing, or you prefer to handle it directly?" I looked out over the dim lawn, the shadow of the hydrangea bush we'd planted together last spring, barely visible in the dusk. "Be there," I said. "This needs to be witnessed." When I locked up that night, I didn't hesitate. I pulled the key from my ring, pressed it against the door for a moment, then slid it into my purse. Not to return. Not this time. The day before their return, I walked down to the clubhouse in Roswell Lakes, folder in hand, heels steady on the pavement like I had somewhere worth arriving. The HOA president, Mr. Collier, was already waiting by the office, holding a clipboard and wearing the same faintly amused expression he'd worn when I first met him at the neighborhood picnic 2 summers ago. Back then, I brought deviled eggs and watched Simone pretend not to see me. Today I brought documents and requested something more formal. "I'd like to request a special meeting," I told him, voice calm, tone official. "Homeownership status clarification. The property at 239 Dovecote." He blinked once, caught off guard, not by the request, but by the certainty of it. I handed over my printout from the county clerk, the original deed, and the notice of sale. "I'm still the primary owner," I added, letting the papers speak. He glanced down at the stack, then back at me. "You want the board present?" "Yes. And all homeowners CC'd on the invite. October 15th, 6:30 sharp. In the main hall." It wasn't a demand. It was protocol. And protocol is hard to argue with when it comes in a tidy manila folder, color-coded and date-stamped. Mr. Collier gave a slow nod, his mouth pulling into a line that said he'd seen plenty of drama in his years. But this was something new. As I left, I could already hear the gears turning, emails drafted, chairs arranged, the hum of community theater with stakes high enough to buzz. I knew full well what that meeting would look like. Simone, freshly tanned, clutching her designer tote like a shield. Marcus, caught somewhere between outrage and disbelief, hoping charm might still do the work integrity had long abandoned. Neighbors murmuring, board members flipping through copies of documents they hadn't known they needed. But I wasn't walking in for spectacle. I was walking in for clarity. That evening, I sent the HOA-wide email myself, attaching the relevant documents and copying Jeanette, Mason Green, and Mr. Collier. I labeled it simply Ownership Confirmation and Sale Disclosure, 239 Dovecote Lane. No commentary, no flourish, just the truth, laid bare, CC'd for convenience. On October 15th, at exactly 6:30 p.m., the doors of the Roswell Lakes HOA Hall swung open, and in they walked, sunburnt, wide-eyed, and a step behind their usual polish. Simone's hair was still curled from vacation, though humidity had taken its toll. Marcus wore a polo, and that familiar look he used to give me in high school when he forgot a paper was due. They weren't ready, not for this kind of room. The hall was already full. Folding chairs lined in perfect rows, neighbors shifting in their seats, the fluorescent lights bright and unforgiving. At the front, the projector hummed quietly, casting the property deed across a white screen like scripture. My name sat at the top of the title in bold, indisputable type. Ellison Loretta May. No addendums. No substitutions. Jeanette sat beside me in her slate gray suit, unreadable but unmistakably present. On her other side was Mason Green, neatly stacked papers resting on his lap, his pen already clicking quietly in rhythm. Mr. Collier stood near the podium, flipping through a copy of the agenda, clearly both intrigued and unsettled by the crowd that had assembled for what was usually a 10-minute formality. Simone stopped short when she saw the screen. Her mouth opened, closed again. Marcus turned toward me like he expected a hug and a hush, as if proximity could still override documentation. "Mama, what is this?" "This," I said, without rising, "is a meeting of record." They didn't sit. They hovered, unsure whether to play innocent or indignant. Around us, phones were already out, pretending to text, pretending not to film. The room was quiet, expectant, not cruel, but not sympathetic either. Neighbors who'd once waved at Marcus from across their driveways were now curious spectators. A few recognized the attorney. More recognized the tone. Simone's voice finally broke through the static, strained, but still clinging to command. "You're putting this on display? In front of strangers?" I stood then, slow and deliberate, and turned toward the front row. "These aren't strangers," I said, gesturing around the room. "They're witnesses." At that, even Mr. Collier straightened. Because once truth is projected, no one can claim they missed the memo. I walked to the folding table at the front of the room and laid each document down like cards in a hand I'd been holding for too long. First came the mortgage freeze letter, printed on First Atlanta Bank's letterhead, time-stamped August 10th, signed by Mr. Choi himself. Next, the fraud alert filed with Wells Fargo, marked urgent in red, detailing the unauthorized draw against my home equity line. I placed it down slowly, let the room see the figure, $28,000 unpaid. Then, the original property deed, printed in color, highlighted where my name stood alone under owner of record. Simone's lips parted as if to object, but she said nothing. Perhaps for the first time, even she recognized the authority of paper. I kept going. Last came the contractor invoice, retrieved through Wells Fargo's claims department. It listed the remodel costs Simone had tried to bury under my name, down to the imported Italian tile she'd bragged about in her stories, not realizing the receipt would one day resurface in a different room. I smoothed the corners, looked up at the semicircle of HOA board members, then to Marcus, who hadn't moved. He broke first, voice low, not meeting my eyes. Is this legal?" I turned to Jeanette, who stood without rush, as though the question had been expected. Her heels clicked once against the tile before she spoke. "Every item presented tonight has been filed, notarized, and entered into public record. The sale has been initiated under co-owner rights, and the corrective deed process is already underway through Fulton County." Simone let out a brittle laugh, something between disbelief and panic. You can't humiliate us like this. You did that part yourselves. Jeanette replied, calm as a still pond. We're simply here to correct the record. In the back, someone's phone buzzed audibly. Mr. Collier adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and said, "This meeting will be entered into HOA minutes as a matter of legal standing. Given the breach of fiscal transparency, ownership clarity is in the neighborhood's best interest." The weight in the room shifted. Simone went still. Marcus looked like a man who'd realized too late the bridge he'd burned was the one holding him up. Jeanette remained standing, arms folded neatly in front of her, as the air in the room settled into something heavier than silence. You could hear the weight of it, phones buzzing quietly, chairs creaking under discomfort, breaths held too long. Simone's composure cracked first, the strain behind her flawless appearance finally breaking through in her voice. "You're doing this out of spite," she hissed, no longer hiding behind her performance. "Because we didn't invite you. Because you can't stand not being the center of attention." Jeanette didn't flinch. "No, Mrs. Landry. My client is doing this because she has legal rights which have been violated. You're confusing consequence with cruelty." Mr. Collier nodded gravely, flipping through the HOA bylaws in his folder. "And as president of the board, I have to note that this lack of disclosure on deed ownership and pending sale presents a liability for the neighborhood. All financial stakeholders must be disclosed to avoid complications during resale. Ownership must reflect transparency." Simone turned red, not the soft blush of embarrassment, but the sharp flush of someone caught without recourse. She stepped back slightly, shoulders stiff, as if shrinking might lessen the impact. "You're humiliating us," she whispered, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "No," I said quietly, finally stepping forward again. "I'm revealing what you tried to hide." My voice wasn't angry. It wasn't trembling. It was simply finished. I looked around the room. Neighbors I'd passed in the grocery aisle, smiled at during mailbox runs, stood beside in line for barbecue at community picnics. Most wouldn't meet my eyes. A few did, with the uneasy recognition of those who now saw more than they ever bothered to ask about. Across from me, Marcus was still silent. His shoulders sagged, as though the weight of the lie had finally found its true form. I reached into the folder one last time and slid a slim white envelope across the table to Jeanette. Inside was the final sale listing agreement, notarized and ready. "This house will be sold within 30 days, she announced. "All parties not on the deed will be notified of vacate expectations. Per the purchase agreement, no consent is needed." And with that, the performance was over. Only the truth remained. The room didn't empty right away. People lingered, their bodies still but their eyes everywhere, watching, whispering, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. A few neighbors looked at me with quiet nods of acknowledgement. Others avoided eye contact, their curiosity outrunning their courtesy. It wasn't malice, not really, just the small, electrified thrill of proximity to someone else's scandal. And tonight, I had made mine undeniable. Simone's parents were the first to leave. Her mother stood rigid as stone, lips pressed tight, and her father muttered something clipped, maybe an apology, maybe a curse, before both of them exited without a word to Marcus or Simone. Their heels echoed sharply against the hall floor, the final punctuation to a chapter they hadn't known they were characters in. I watched their backs retreat without satisfaction. Their silence said enough. Across the aisle, the neighbors from 2 doors down, Brian and Cynthia, who once called me Miss L with warmth, now offered only a tense smile, the kind that stretches across discomfort and dies in the eyes. The coolness in their expressions was clear. Allegiance had shifted. Nobody wanted to be associated with the couple who brought drama into property values. Simone stood frozen, phone clutched in one hand, mascara slightly smudged beneath one eye. Her usual poise had crumbled under the pressure of witnesses and paperwork. She looked not like a wronged daughter-in-law, but like someone who had misread the script and couldn't improvise. Her glossed lips moved silently before she turned away from me entirely. Marcus, he didn't look at me, not even once. He stayed near the exit, head down, shoulders curled inward, as though he could fold himself into invisibility. Not long ago, that same man would lift my grocery bags without asking. Now, he couldn't lift his chin. He didn't speak. Not a single word. He just stood there, caught between the woman he married and the mother he underestimated. By 7:15 p.m., the room was nearly empty. Jeanette packed the folder carefully, handed me the original deed like a final blessing, and said, "You didn't just win, Loretta. You restored the record." Outside, the night was cool, the sky dusted with early autumn stars. I walked to my car alone, but not diminished. Mason moved quickly, just as promised. A private buyer from Charlotte. Young couple, no kids yet, but excited for the neighborhood and respectful of the process, made a clean offer after one walkthrough. They paid in cash, no contingencies. The check cleared 3 days later, and $187,000 wired into my personal account before noon. It wasn't about the money, though. It never had been. It was about the boundary, drawn, enforced, and honored. Simone's name never appeared in the paperwork. Her credit, however, did. The $28,000 renovation debt, left hanging like an unpaid tab, was reported to Equifax through Wells Fargo's fraud division. She received formal notice of the delinquency, along with a fraud claim resolution, stating her misuse of funds was documented and verified. I didn't press charges. I didn't need to. The paper trail stood tall on its own. Marcus tried to call once, blocked number, early morning, but I let it go to voicemail. His voice was small, asking if there was any way to talk. But there wasn't. Not now. The conversation had already been had, in front of neighbors, a board, and the law. I deleted the message without replaying it. That afternoon, I stood in my new space, a 2-bedroom condo in Midtown Atlanta, high enough up to catch the skyline, quiet enough to feel like starting over. It wasn't grand, but it was mine, purchased with the closing funds and a modest supplement from what Harold and I had built. The walls were still bare, save for a photo of Marcus at 5 years old I couldn't yet part with, and the deed, framed now, hung just above the key rack near the door. On that hook, I placed my last set of keys to Dovecote Lane. I didn't throw them away. I didn't keep them out of sentiment. I hung them as a reminder of what I gave, of what they took, and of what I reclaimed. No fanfare, no final confrontation, just closure. Out on the small balcony, I watched the evening unfold. Midtown glimmered in the distance, alive with possibility. And for the first time in a long while, I felt still and seen. They may have tried to define family without me, but I, at last, had defined myself.